All right, today we're diving into the history of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and wow, is it a story. It's vast, it's complex, and honestly, a lot of it is just tragic. We're talking about a place with incredible wealth, but also immense suffering. It's a story about a relentless struggle for control, one that's still going on. So let's get into it and see how it all happened.
So this really gets to the heart of the paradox of the Congo, doesn't it? You have this nation right in the center of Africa that is just blessed with unbelievable natural wealth. I mean, some of the most valuable resources on Earth are right there, and yet its people are among the poorest in the world. How does that happen? Well, it's no accident. It is the direct result of a long, brutal history of exploitation coming from the outside and, sadly, from within.
Okay, Part 1, Kingdoms and Early Contact. Now, to really get a grip on what's happening today, we've got to rewind, way back. Because long before any Europeans showed up, this region was home to some really sophisticated societies and powerful kingdoms. And I mean deep history. We're talking settlements going back 90,000 years. By the 1300s, you had these large, really well-organized kingdoms. Think the Congo, the Luba, the Lunda, running the show. So when Portuguese sailors first arrived in the late 1400s, they weren't stumbling into some backwater. They were making contact with a thriving state. But that relationship, well, it turned catastrophic and fast. The reason? The Atlantic slave trade. It just completely devastated the region, tearing the heart out of these societies for hundreds of years.
4 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. 4 million people, enslaved and shipped across the Atlantic from this one region. For centuries, the area around the mouth of the Congo River was basically ground zero for the slave trade in Africa. This incredible loss of life, this hollowing out of a population, and all the violence that came with it, that was the first major trauma inflicted from the outside. And it set a really, really grim precedent for what was still to come.
Part 2, Leopold's Reign of Terror. So, after the slave trade finally started to wind down, you might think things would get better. Nope. The next chapter of exploitation was, if you can believe it, even more systematic, and in a lot of ways, just more perverse. And it all revolved around the personal ambition of one man, King Leopold II of Belgium.
And get this, he called it the Congo Free State. That name is one of the most horrifying lies in history, because this wasn't a Belgian colony. It wasn't owned by the country of Belgium. No, it was the personal, private property of King Leopold himself. He went around telling the world he was on some great humanitarian mission to end slavery and bring civilization. But what he actually created was a gigantic, for-profit slave state, his own personal piggy bank, larger than all of Western Europe.
So, how did he pull this off? Well, he set up a private mercenary army called the Force Publique, made up of black soldiers led by white officers to basically terrorize everyone. The entire population was forced to go out and collect rubber and ivory. They were given these impossible quotas, and if you didn't meet your quota, the punishment was swift and it was brutal. The practice of severing the hands of men, women, even children, that became the sickening, horrifying symbol of his entire operation.
The result of this whole system? Democide. The population just plummeted. A landmark investigation, the Casement Report of 1904, exposed all of this to the world. And it estimated that the population of the Congo dropped by as many as 10 million people during Leopold's rule. 10 million! From murder, from starvation, from disease. It's a human catastrophe on a scale it's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
Yeah, Roger Casman's report was an absolute bombshell. His account was direct, it was unflinching, and it detailed these atrocities for the whole world to see. He laid it all out. The so-called war, the starvation, the diseases, everything that led to the country's depopulation. This created a massive international outcry. The public pressure just became so intense that Leopold couldn't hold on to his private kingdom any longer.
All right, Part 3, A Nation's Fractured Birth. Now, the end of Leopold's personal rule, that didn't mean freedom for the Congolese people. Not at all. It was really just a change in management. And this new management would, decades down the line, lead to the chaotic and incredibly violent birth of a new nation.
So, facing all that international pressure, Leopold was forced to hand over his private state. In 1908, it officially became the Belgian Congo. And okay, the absolute worst of the red rubber atrocities, the hand chopping, that stuff ended. But the system of exploitation, that kept right on going. It was run by what they called the colonial trinity, the Belgian state, Catholic missionaries, and big private companies all working together to suck the wealth out of the Congo.
The weird thing is, the push for independence happened incredibly fast, like lightning fast.
After World War II, you started to see a small Congolese middle class, the Evolués, and they started forming political parties. By the late 50s, the demand for independence just exploded. After some major riots in 1959, Belgium basically just threw up its hands and granted independence in 1960 to a country that was completely unprepared for it. The result? Total chaos. Just 5 days after independence, the army mutinied and the whole country just fell apart. The Congo crisis had begun.
And of course, this chaos immediately went global. Why? The Cold War. The Congo's very first democratically elected prime minister, a guy named Patrice Lumumba, was desperate to hold the country together, so he asked the Soviet Union for help. Well, you can imagine how that went over in Washington. For the United States, a Soviet-allied leader in the heart of Africa was a non-starter. So the CIA and the U.S. government immediately started backing his rivals, President Kasavubu and the head of the army, Colonel Joseph Mobutu. Just like that, Congo's internal crisis became a full-blown Cold War battleground.
And what happened next was a defining tragedy for the country. In 1961, Prime Minister Lumumba was captured, he was tortured, and he was executed. Years later, an official Belgian inquiry confirmed what many suspected. He was killed with the help of Belgian officers and with the complicity of the United States. The murder of the country's first real democratic leader, it was just a devastating blow. It basically crushed any hopes for democracy and paved the way for decades of dictatorship.
Which brings us to part 4, the long era of Zaire. With Lumumba dead and the country still in chaos, one man saw a huge opportunity. And it was that same army chief who helped get rid of Lumumba. He was about to seize power and rule a country with an iron fist for more than 30 years.
So, Joseph Mobutu officially seized total power in a coup in 1965. And one of the first things he did to consolidate his power was launch this massive cultural campaign he called Authenticity. It was all about creating a new national identity. He renamed the country Zaire. He changed the names of cities, like Leopoldville became Kinshasa. He even made citizens get rid of their Western names and adopt African ones. And of course, he renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko. It was a brilliant, if cynical, way to build a cult of personality and create a one-party state that revolved completely around him.
For the next 30 years, Mobutu was basically the textbook Cold War dictator. The US and the West propped him up because he was anti-communist. In return, they looked the other way as he crushed all dissent and just systematically plundered the country. He became one of the richest men in the world, embezzling billions upon billions of dollars, while the country's economy and infrastructure just completely collapsed around him. But then, the Cold War ended. Suddenly, his Western support dried up, and his rotten, corrupt regime was left totally exposed.
Part 5. Africa's Great War. So you'd think the fall of a brutal dictator would be a good thing, right? Well, the collapse of Mobutu's regime didn't lead to peace, not even close. Instead, it was like taking the cork out of a bottle. Decades of pent-up anger and ethnic tension just exploded. It created this massive power vacuum that sucked in all the neighboring countries, igniting what would become the deadliest conflict on the planet since World War II.
And the spark that lit this regional fire came from right next door, in Rwanda. In 1994, after the horrific Rwandan genocide, millions of Hutu refugees flooded across the border into eastern Zaire. But hiding among them were the Hutu militias, the genocidaires, who had carried out the killings. They started using these massive refugee camps as bases to launch attacks back into Rwanda. Well, the new Rwandan government wasn't going to stand for that, so they invaded. That was it. That was the spark.
That invasion kicked off the First Congo War, which actually toppled Mobutu pretty quickly in 1997. But the new guy they put in charge, Laurent Kabila, he immediately turned on his Rwandan and Ugandan backers. And that sparked the Second Congo War in 1998. And this was the big one. The complexity is just staggering. You had the DRC government and its allies, like Angola and Zimbabwe, fighting against multiple rebel groups who were backed by Rwanda and Uganda. All in all, you had something like 9 different countries and dozens of armed groups all fighting inside the Congo. They started calling it Africa's World War for a reason.
And the human cost, it's just astronomical. An estimated 5.4 million people, let me say that again, 5.4 million people died in the Congo Wars between 1996 and 2003. And the tragic part is, most of them weren't killed by bullets or bombs. They died from the consequences of the war. Disease, starvation, the total collapse of healthcare and society. It is, to this day, the deadliest conflict the world has seen since World War II.
Okay, part 6, a fragile present and an uncertain future. The big multinational war officially ended with a peace deal in 2003. But the thing is, the violence never really stopped. The country today is still living with the scars and the legacy of that war, facing a really fragile present and a very, very uncertain future. You know, there are some hopeful signs. In 2019, the DRC had its first ever peaceful transfer of power, which is huge. But the day-to-day reality, especially in the eastern part of the country, is still incredibly grim. We're talking about regions like North and South Kivu, in Ituri, where there are literally over 100 different armed groups still fighting. You've got major players like M23, which is a powerful Rwandan-backed group, the ADF, which has ties to ISIS, and countless local militias, like Kodako. And what's fueling it all? It's the same curse that has plagued this country from the beginning. It's immense mineral wealth. The red rubber from Leopold's time has just been replaced by the coltan and cobalt that are in our smartphones and electric cars. It's this wealth that keeps fueling the violence, as everyone, militias, neighboring countries, corrupt officials, fights for a piece of the pie.
And really, that brings us right back to the central, gut-wrenching question that hangs over everything. After centuries of being plundered by the slave traders, by King Leopold, by Mobutu, and now by all these warlords, can the Congo's incredible natural wealth ever become a blessing for its own people, instead of a perpetual curse?
The story of the Congo is obviously still being written. If you want to keep learning about the complex histories that shape our world, you should definitely check out the other videos in our Quick Country Histories playlist. And hey, if you got something out of this explainer, we'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to Notebook Summaries. Thanks so much for joining me.